February 1945, Crimea, a winter coast that felt remote even to those who had crossed oceans and continents to reach it. Inside the Livadia Palace, high ceilings trapped a soft chill, carpets dulled footsteps, and the air smelled faintly of coal and old varnish. Couriers moved with folders pressed tight to their sides, while aides compared drafts that changed by a phrase here, a sentence there. The war in Europe had not yet ended, yet schedules were printed for morning sessions and evening briefings that implied a future already under review. Names carried weight, but so did pauses, and observers later noted that tone often mattered more than the clause it accompanied. In this program, we reconstruct a plausible sequence based on public records, memoirs, and archival notations that remain accessible. The narrative is speculative in form while grounded in the time, place, and pressures documented in meeting agendas and communiqués. We avoid declaring final truths. Where interpretations appear, they reflect patterns that could be inferred from the paper trail that survives and from the caution embedded in diplomatic language. Our approach remains measured. Scenes are suggested by credible habits of the era, the rhythm of official days and private evenings, and the signals that emerged when pens hovered over maps. The atmosphere was ceremonial yet watchful, the language formal yet elastic. Borders might be discussed as temporary devices while sounding fixed. Promises could be spoken broadly while intended narrowly. What follows treats the palace as a working floor at the edge of a battlefield, and the conversations as drafts of a world that was not yet secure. The first full day set a tone that felt meticulous rather than hurried, as if ceremony itself served as a metronome for decisions still forming underneath. Cars arrived in a narrow loop outside the main steps, engines ticking in the cold as staff coordinated coats, briefcases, and carefully rehearsed routes through corridors already mapped by security. Inside, fireplaces contributed little heat, but offered a focus point for small clusters of aides who checked the day's order in low voices. The rooms had been arranged to signal parity, chairs of similar height, identical writing pads, and a single arrangement of flowers that would not distract from the paper at hand. The morning opened with courtesies that were brief but exact. Acknowledgments of the war's strain were expressed calmly, followed by a reminder that operational matters would remain in other channels while these sessions addressed political shape and sequence. A preliminary agenda, copied overnight by clerks assigned to alternating hours, indicated that borders, administration, and future voting procedures would be handled in modular discussions rather than as a single sweep, a structure that implied containment while allowing space for adjustments. The sense of urgency showed not in raised voices, but in how quickly pencils moved when a phrase seemed usable. Lunch, taken at a long table under a muted chandelier, had the quiet tempo of men eating because the schedule demanded it. Buttered bread, soup that cooled fast, and the second round of tea or coffee that staff anticipated without asking. It was hospitality stripped of leisure. Conversations at the table stayed above specifics, though now and then a short, dry observation appeared to test how a word would land when placed against a different word. Afterward, smaller rooms received delegations in sequences that favored short bursts, 15 to 30 minutes at a time, no more. Enough to lay a marker, not enough to lock a draft. The official posture described the day as cooperative and steady, yet two kinds of signals emerged. One came from a note in the morning agenda that used a neutral verb for what some expected to be firm review instead of confirm, suggesting that outcomes would depend on context not yet visible. Another came from a set of margin annotations in a staff copy of the afternoon schedule, where asterisks marked items likely to be revisited even if they appeared resolved, a habit in wartime planning that guarded against surprises. The palace's geography mattered. A corridor lined with tall windows became a holding space where envoys changed pace before entering meetings. The view of frost on hedges had the unintended effect of slowing breath, steadying tone. A second-floor room with 3 doors, all kept ajar, allowed senior aides to step in and out, passing slim folders that gathered small edits on the way. The day's rhythm produced its own credibility. Even without grand declarations, the accumulation of notes and carefully shared drafts indicated that a set of shared surfaces was forming. But the distance between surface and core was felt when a private briefing recorded in the evening summarized progress using the phrase conditional convergence, a choice of words that signaled alignment only under certain interpretations. At dusk, lamps turned the palace yellow against a dark sea. The final appointment before dinner was brief, perhaps on purpose. It allowed everyone to claim that the day had closed without final claims and with constructive exchanges, a line suitable for any communiqué. Yet, as coat collars rose and papers were tied with thin cotton tape, questions remained parked in the margins of the draft agenda for the next morning, where a single line, maps to be introduced after preliminary remarks, pointed the story toward lines and shades that would matter far beyond this room. And with that, the focus moved toward the map tables laid out in the adjacent gallery for the following session. Entering the gallery, the language of the meeting changed without anyone announcing it. Maps quieted people. The room had wide tables placed end to end, each covered with sheets marked by lines that looked permanent, even when a pencil could erase them. Two staffers kept blotting paper at hand to avoid smudges on fresh annotations. A preliminary statement acknowledged that military realities had altered conditions on the ground, then pivoted to principles of administration, recovery, and representation. The phrasing sounded universal by design. It sheltered many meanings while committing to none beyond the broadest. When the first map was unrolled, the table edge caught and a crease had to be smoothed with the flat of a palm. That minor interruption gave everyone an extra second to settle their faces into expressions intended for steady work. Discussants spoke of zones and interim arrangements, while treating language about elections and independence as compatible with security needs. A pairing that made sense in sentences even as it strained under the weight of context. Aides exchanged small cards that summarized positions so far, a practice meant to reduce drift and keep any single statement from becoming a formal offer. An indicator of what counted as progress appeared in a single-page draft for a press communiqué prepared earlier that morning. It contained a few phrases that would survive revisions: cooperation, shared objectives, and forward steps in restoration. The same page left blanks where specifics would invite debate. Those blanks were treated as safety valves, not omissions. The day pressed on with remarks in which distance measured meaning. When leaders spoke close to the text, phrases matching the map lines, silence followed, as if inviting time to make those words heavier. When they spoke farther from the map, a broad comment on reconstruction or relief, conversation warmed for a moment, then cooled when pencils returned to the paper. Poland's outline sat in the center more often than not, and while no one used the word final, some words suggested momentum. A note from a staff account mentions consolidating the formula, which may mean that certain eastward shifts were treated as practical facts, while compensation in the West entered the realm of plausible. The record that survives in fragments shows careful avoidance of adjectives. Nouns did the work, swallowing disputes inside procedural labels. By late afternoon, the conversation shifted from borders to the structure that would manage transitions. A document labeled Declaration Draft circulated to a narrow circle, promising assistance to peoples liberated from occupation, and promising also that governments would emerge through broadly inclusive methods. The draft used terms that sounded clear until they were parsed. Who would supervise inclusion and what counted as undue pressure remained background questions that could be answered later according to circumstances. Another indicator, this time a set of meeting minutes drafted by a secretary with a compact hand, captured that the discussion proceeded in good order while registering that final language remains under consideration, a phrase often used when there is agreement on the banner but not on the tent. The map table was then set aside, literally. Staff rolled the sheets and slid them into tubes marked by thin colored cords, a system that helped clerks find the right set when the next session called for it. The mood did not brighten or dim. It held steady, as if the day had reached the point where everyone accepted the limits of clarity. Commitments could be stated. Their interpretation would depend on who held ground and who held paper. The day's last exchange avoided the appearance of strain. It used phrases that could be quoted at home. Settlement seemed within reach, said one sequence of remarks, provided that due process in reconstruction was respected under local conditions. The mirror phrase answered that stability required coordinated frameworks and respect for security concerns arising from recent devastation. Between these two sentences lived an understanding that sounded compatible and yet could function as a hinge. The evening program included a formal dinner that required protocol, seating cards, and a short moment by a piano that had not been tuned for years. And with the table set and the communiqués waiting for non-specific praise, the narrative moved toward the dining hall, where structured courtesy would carry the story forward without admitting what the paper still withheld. The dining hall worked as a second stage that night, not because decisions were made there, but because credibility was performed there. Seating plans reduced surprises. The order of service followed a list set by the protocol office, with courses that appeared on time and servers who kept conversations from stalling by arriving just as pauses threatened to become awkward. Toasts were measured, neither exuberant nor grim, and their content reflected the day's mixed clarity, appreciation for sacrifice, affirmation of alliance, and the repeated promise of constructive work. What mattered most were the short after-dinner passages when the principals stepped to a side room and aides filtered in with fresh drafts. These were the moments where a single sentence could be made to travel, designed to reach the public while leaving room for future adjustments. A phrase about cooperation on liberated territories was given a softer edge with a subordinate clause that sounded generous while committing no timeline. Another line on transitional administrations gained a qualifier that turned potential obligations into options. The atmosphere allowed this diplomatic carpentry because no one wanted to return to the map tables with tempers roughened by ceremony. Photographs followed, arranged to convey unity through proximity and posture. Jackets were straightened, ties eased into a uniform angle, and hands placed so that no one appeared hesitant or assertive beyond the others. The cameras captured faces that looked tired but composed, which matched the expected story: dedicated men, carrying work late into the evening. Official accounts would later cite these images as evidence of cohesion. Those who stood in the second row, however, may have noticed that smiles were thin and brief, functional rather than warm. After the photographs, small groups formed along the corridor where drafts of the declaration had been duplicated. The paper was still warm from the machine, and clerks delivered packets tied with narrow ribbon to prevent sheets from mixing in motion. A short reading revealed language that many would recognize years later. The declaration committed to help rebuild political life and encouraged methods that sounded open. It also promised to respond jointly to immediate needs. These sentences felt safe for publication. What drew attention from senior aides was a paragraph that left room for local factors to define implementation. In practice, that line created a seam wide enough for divergent methods. No voice raised objection. The point of these hours was plausible harmony, not forensic debate. To record momentum, a private note was entered into a log kept by a rotating duty officer. It described productive exchanges and alignment on general aims, matching the language of most wartime briefings, and it added that details would be subject to follow-up mechanisms to be refined by commissions. That line mattered. Commissions diffuse tension and buy time. They also move key questions away from the stage to working rooms where phrases can be shaped without the pressure of a spotlight. Meanwhile, the reparations question, which tended to spike the temperature, was handled in outline rather than in numbers. A gesture to create a commission could be presented as progress, while the hard arithmetic stayed unspoken. A separate discussion touched on future security and voting procedures in the new international body under design. The tone remained formal and careful. One side asked for a structure that safeguarded operational freedom in emergencies. Others accepted that language as essential to participation. The compromise was not a compromise in the normal sense. It was the confirmation that participation required terms that everyone already anticipated. Before midnight, the corridor quieted and the dining hall was reset for the next day's breakfast. The day's final paper trail consisted of the revised declaration draft, a sheet confirming the convening of commissions on reparations and administrative arrangements, and a cover note summarizing the evening as steady progress. The phrase did not promise success. It signaled that the meeting remained on script. The night ended with a brief walk through a side garden path where lamps stayed dim to preserve fuel. No one lingered. Back inside, a clerk assembled the morning folder with the latest draft on top, binding it with a narrow strip to signal its priority. The folder included a clipped communiqué outline indicating that public statements would emphasize unity and shared responsibility for Europe's recovery, while the private day ahead would return to unresolved margins. With preparations complete and the palace settling into quiet, the narrative carries into the next morning's smaller room where the declaration language meets last edits and the commissions take shape in working notes. Morning returned with a narrower room and fewer faces, which made the discussion feel closer to the paper. The declaration text lay open in 3 identical copies, each bearing light pencil marks from the previous night. The preamble affirmed shared aims in Europe, then set the expectation that liberated peoples would shape their political life in conditions free of intimidation. The phrasing sounded sturdy, yet every sturdy sentence carried a hinge. One clause promised assistance through consultation, which implied help without prescribing methods. Another stressed restoration of basic freedoms, a phrase that traveled well, though its pace might differ from place to place. An aide read the paragraphs aloud with an even voice, pausing where commas made room for meaning. The stops and starts were not dramatic, but they mattered. Everyone heard the same words, and each could hear something different inside them. After the reading, a short exchange noted that any declaration should balance promise with practicality. The room agreed without pushing the edge. A note in the meeting minutes later summarized the tone as constructive and precise, and it added a spare line, final wording subject to alignment with existing commitments. That spare line might sound routine, yet it placed the text inside a larger frame that included military facts, occupation duties, and the necessity of continuity. The draft avoided the word enforcement. It chose reassurance instead. It used the language of assistance rather than the language of oversight. These choices seemed designed to keep attention on what the declaration opened, not what it closed. At the table's end, a clerk compared the 3 copies and circled small variants so that nothing would drift between versions. When discussion moved to implementation, the edges showed. The room recognized that liberation could not be separated from administration, and administration could not be separated from security. The draft acknowledged local authority while welcoming outside support. It left unanswered the scope of that support, which might be generous in one place and discreet in another. The possibility of a joint commission reappeared as a device to manage friction. It was neither novel nor dramatic, just a known method that allowed work to continue while postponing a sharp choice. Midday drew attention to another thread that must attach cleanly to the declaration. The future international body, still moving through its own drafts, required agreement on voting rules that would make participation credible for each major power. The conversation restated positions that had been expressed before. One side emphasized the need for a blocking tool during critical matters. Another noted the importance of a voting procedure that did not paralyze ordinary decisions. The balance reached had the logic of a wartime contract. Participation depended on a special safeguard for the strongest, while routine functions should remain workable for the whole. The communiqués later would describe this as a step towards solid cooperation. The room, in private, treated it as confirmation of a condition that everyone already understood. Lunch arrived without ceremony, served quickly, then cleared to keep the table free for paper. In the afternoon, the discussion turned to the declaration's final paragraph. It would say something about joint responsibility for relief and the revival of economic life. Again, the phrasing tried to satisfy the widest number of audiences. The paragraph agreed that devastation could not be managed piecemeal and that relief efforts should avoid overlap. The practical meaning was obvious. Stocks were thin, transport fragile, and winter still pressed on towns that lacked heat. Yet the text kept to general terms, knowing that specific lists would invite debate out of proportion to the day's purpose. A second copy of the agenda listed an evening slot for polishing the press note. The note would point to unity, outline shared principles, and briefly mention that details would be handled by appropriate bodies. This careful structure kept the announcement light enough to travel, but grounded enough to withstand questions from officials waiting at home. In the last hour, edit slowed. The room tracked toward assent. A final read-through corrected a preposition that threatened ambiguity and removed an adjective that felt like an argument in disguise. No one raised their voice. The sense of movement depended on tempo rather than volume, and the tempo held steady. A secretary entered with a clean typescript asking for initials at the margin to confirm approval of the text for circulation. Pens touched the page with small strokes that looked unimportant and were not. The desk was cleared, copies stacked, and the evening was left for messages to capitals and a short rehearsal of remarks that would claim restraint and progress in equal measure. As dusk collected at the windows, the atmosphere stayed measured and a little tired. There was enough agreement to speak of a declaration, enough unfinished work to avoid triumph. A final sentence in the minutes noted that amendments, if any, would be minor and made for clarity rather than substance. That sentence might be read as optimism or as management. In either case, it kept the day aligned with the line already drawn. From this working room, focus shifts to a nearby chamber where the Polish outline and the structure of its governance come forward with their own careful vocabulary and their own quiet pressures. The final full day carried a sense of completion without pretending to closure. The morning began with a short review of the declaration text, the commission charters, and the press formulations prepared for release. The declaration would appear as a statement of shared aims and supportive methods. The commission charters would identify subjects and participants, but not outcomes. The press formulations would declare good progress with prudent restraint. This design avoided confrontation while offering enough structure to satisfy those who required proof that the meeting had accomplished more than conversation. A limited signing process followed, quiet and unadorned. It was not a treaty spectacle. It was an administrative act that allowed distribution. Pens scratched, pages were aligned, and a clerk applied a small stamp on the back page for tracking. Initials were added where signatures were not customary. The record stayed clean and modest. Afterward, the room pivoted to the schedule for departure. Trains and planes had been arranged with redundancies, a precaution that belonged to wartime planning and not to diplomacy. Private briefings were held in sequences of 10 minutes. Each principal confirmed points to be emphasized at home and words to be saved for later. The list was not long. It included commitment to cooperation in Europe's recovery, agreement on mechanisms to address unsettled matters, and assurance that the international body would receive full support. The sensitive questions were addressed through phrases designed to hold. They would not dissolve under pressure, but they could bend if needed. Midday brought a quiet exchange on the Far Eastern Theater, handled in outline with references to acceptable conditions for participation and the timing of future steps once current battles reached their expected stages. Nothing more was pressed into the record. The minutes entered a line about mutual understanding and alignment of perspectives, a line that functioned like a screen. It showed a shape and hid its finer weave. Lunch was brief, and the remaining hours were given to the mechanics of release. Teams confirmed that the communiqués were consistent across languages. Care was taken that words like assistance, consultation, and restoration appeared with the same tone everywhere. A press notice was scheduled for the evening, timed to reach early editions in several capitals. A second notice, shorter, would follow the next morning to restate the essential points after departure. What remained were photographs and farewells. The photographs were arranged with moderation. There would be images near a window with pale light and images at the table in view of folders, but nothing that suggested triumph or strain. The farewells were cordial, bounded by function, and they ended quickly because the hour pressed. Outside, the grounds were damp from a thaw that had begun overnight. Cars pulled close to the steps so that heavy coats did not collect too much moisture. Packages of documents were carried in small cases by aides, each labeled by day and topic to prevent misfiles in transit. As the convoy formed, a staff officer checked off items on a schedule card: declaration copies, commission charters, press notes, travel orders. The last entry simply read, "Secure dispatch." Inside the palace, rooms were reset to their neutral state, furniture returned to standard positions, and fireplaces left to cool. The duty officer prepared a final log entry that summarized the entire sequence in controlled words. It cited the adoption of the declaration, the plan for commissions, and the intention to continue consultation. It added that conditions in Europe remained fluid and that further communication would be required. The page closed with initials that looked small against the weight of its subject. Departure unfolded without incident. Engines rose in steady tones, and the convoy lifted away from the palace with the measured pace of a routine procession. No one waved from windows. Such gestures belonged to other kinds of days. In the quiet that followed, staff gathered stray folders, rewrapped maps, and made note of items to be archived once routes were secure. The palace settled into stillness that felt temporary and complete at once. On the books, the meeting had met its objectives. In practice, the objectives had been defined to be met. That is not a criticism. It is a description of how high meetings survived the friction of their own context. As the last door closed and the final guard post reported clear, the narrative edges toward the release of texts to the wider world and the first reactions in distant offices, where phrases would be read line by line, setting the stage for the measured announcement that waited at the next stop on the route. The chamber held a different energy as the map of Poland returned to the table with renewed attention. The room acknowledged two distinct matters: where the lines would rest and who would speak for people within those lines. Neither could be addressed in isolation. The conversation began with a quiet recitation of facts on the ground, noted without flourish. The war's progression had altered control and damaged cities whose names were familiar long before these days. When the map lay flat, rulers stayed aside. This was an exchange of principles rather than a drafting exercise. One position described eastern shifts as already made by circumstance, while proposing that compensation in the West could follow a practical course if confirmed by agreement. Another position favored caution, reminding the group that any movement must be accompanied by guarantees that would reassure more than one audience. A mediator's voice suggested holding the technical edge in reserve, while agreeing to a general formula that could be defended in press statements. The room accepted the technique. It had the advantage of keeping alignment visible while keeping flexibility intact. Governance arrived as the next clarity test. The conversation recognized that a local authority existed and that another formed abroad claimed a role. The proposed path used broad words that fit better in a communiqué than in a manual. A rebuilding of public life under conditions that would permit inclusion with the assistance of representatives from within and without. Here, the Declaration on Liberated Europe offered a frame that supported many interpretations. It spoke of methods free from coercion. It offered support in establishing interim departments that could keep daily life functioning. It did not name overseeing instruments. That omission was deliberate, or at least convenient. The minutes recorded that the matter would be advanced through consultation among interested parties, with a view to broadening the base of authority. The sentence was safe, perhaps because safety was its only purpose. Meanwhile, the room acknowledged in calm terms that security realities could not be stepped around. Friendly frontiers were not a topic for trial phrases. They were treated as preconditions for anything else. To keep the table steady, the participants leaned on the technique of parallel sentences. One sentence promised encouragement of open processes. The next recognized the need for practical protections while those processes matured. The pairing could be read as compatible, and it could function as a balancing beam over ground that did not yet feel level. Reports moved in and out. A short field note summarized conditions in several towns, emphasizing shortages and the strain on transport. It recommended coordinated relief to prevent duplication, which offered a concrete pathway for cooperation that did not provoke political argument. The chamber accepted the recommendation and placed it under the same commission structure, developing elsewhere, a familiar pattern that signaled purpose without daring detail. Reparations then appeared at the edge of the conversation like weather seen through glass. No figures crossed the table in open voice. Instead, a paper marked for circulation to a smaller group proposed a mechanism to collect claims and assign categories, leaving arithmetic to a later forum. This offered time and protected the fragile fabric of the day. Aides logged the step in a brief entry, noting that commissions would meet under agreed umbrellas, with findings to be reported in sequence to the principals. The entry used the phrase "working period," which fit the slow rhythm of these arrangements. Afternoon slid toward evening. A communiqué draft captured the Polish matter in 2 sentences that sounded orderly. The sentences affirmed the principle of a broad-based authority and mentioned the intention to encourage conditions favoring free participation in public life. There was no schedule attached. The absence of a schedule allowed governments to claim progress without binding themselves to a date that the war might erase. Photographs were again discussed. It was decided that none would be taken in this chamber. The choice reflected a preference for quiet handling, perhaps to avoid images that could become reference points before the words were ready for final release. A copy of the press note was updated to reflect careful balance. Attention to reconstruction, acknowledgement of joint efforts, and confidence that responsible steps were underway. Inside the room, no one exchanged that confidence as a private sentiment. They treated it as a necessary sentence in a necessary paper. The discussion ended with a plan to pass the matter to the designated envoys tasked with forming the working group. The plan kept everything moving and kept no one from claiming that it moved in a preferred direction. As chairs drew back and the map was lifted once more into its tube, the narrative approached the sessions that would formalize the declaration, note the commission structures, and lay out the timetable for departure, all recorded in schedules that gave the next day a simple outline and left its substance comparatively open. What emerged from Crimea in February 1945 looked coherent on paper, and perhaps it needed to. The language was careful, shaped to balance reassurance and room to maneuver, and anchored by statements that could be quoted in parliament halls and briefing rooms. The declaration promised help for peoples moving back into public life. The commission structure promised work to translate cautious words into steps that could be observed, if not always measured. Voting rules in the new international body signaled that cooperation would be possible when great powers felt protected against decisions they considered decisive. Poland's outline and the method to broaden its authority were placed in sentences that avoided the loud nouns of accusation and the sharp verbs of command. This was the grammar of a world that still heard artillery at night. Our reconstruction remains a speculative frame made from public sources, archived notes, and the rhythm of wartime schedules, and it treats the summit as a working session rather than a pageant. The story does not resolve here. It moves into letters exchanged after departure, into minutes of smaller meetings, into field reports that describe practical choices on cold mornings. Which clauses became anchors and which remained signals may be traced in how local offices interpreted phrases like assistance and inclusion in the months that followed. How much of the map was fixed by will and how much by momentum might be visible only in the omissions that later documents no longer explain. If the paper left seams, did the seams hold when tested, or did they invite new stitching under different hands? The next chapter waits in the corridors where communiqués were unpacked, and in the meeting rooms where agendas quietly resumed, line by line.